DSW 2310 Dual Diagnosis, Treatment and Assessment Prevalence Chapter 2 A Handbook on Dual Diagnosis, 4th edition. Definitions. Intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is characterized by significant limitations in intellectual functioning, adaptive behavior. Mental illness. A syndrome is characterized by clinically significant disturbance in cognition, emotional regulation, dysfunctional behavior, psychological, biological, developmental, processes underlying mental functioning. Issues in prevalence research. Since the 1970s, there is growing research with regards to the coexistence of mental health and developmental disabilities. The more research, the less clear the prevalence rates. Why? Different definitions of intellectual or developmental disabilities. Different definitions of mental illness. Lack of suitable diagnostic instruments. Issues in methodology. Lack of random samples, biased sample, small sample size, lack of control group, lack of differentiation within samples, people of various ages, living situations, intelligence, etc. What do we know about prevalence rates? Resources. Canadian Association of Mental Health, CAMH. Dual Diagnosis and Information Guide. A Pan-American Health Organization, World Health Organization Collaboration Center. Ministry of Community and Social Services, MCSS. How common is dual diagnosis? Large-scale studies indicate that people with developmental disabilities are 3 to 6 times more likely to develop a mental health disorder. Psychotic disorders have been suggested to occur 3 times more often in adults with developmental disabilities. One large study in the UK reported mood disorders, for example major depression, bipolar disorder, dysthymia, were 3 times more common for the developmental disabilities. Anxiety disorders, for example post-traumatic stress disorder, separation anxiety, social phobia, specific phobias, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorders, are common in people with developmental disabilities, especially with genetic syndromes. The overall prevalence of disruptive behavior in adults with developmental disabilities is estimated at 22.5%. Behavior possibly due to an underlying psychiatric disorder or other cause. MCSS, Demographic Prevalence Rates for Dual Diagnosis. Statistics Canada Participation Activity Limitation Survey, PALS, sets the prevalence rate of 0.7% of people with developmental disability in Ontario. Other sources cite the rate between 1 to 3% of the population. Estimated to reside in Ontario, 125,400 persons with a developmental disability. The National Association for the Dually Diagnosed, NADD, estimates 30% of the population with a developmental disability also has a mental health disorder. Other sources have suggested the prevalence rate of dual diagnosis may range as high as 38%. Using the NADD figure of 30%, estimated that approximately 37,620 individuals in Ontario diagnosed with a dual diagnosis. Canadian Mental Health Association. Approximately 1 to 3% of Canadians have a developmental disability. Prevalence rates for dual diagnosis are difficult to identify because studies apply differing criteria to define developmental disabilities and mental health issues. It is generally agreed, however, that individuals with developmental disabilities are 3 to 4 times more likely to develop emotional, behavioral, and psychiatric difficulties than the general population. Recent facts and statistics on dual diagnosis. the United States, Michael's House. Studies have shown that the following: more than 38% of dual diagnosis patients are between 18 and 25. Just over 17% of patients between 18 and 25 years were diagnosed with only a mental health disorder. Approximately 7.2% of patients with co-occurring disorders are over 50. Approximately 28% of patients diagnosed with a mental health disorder, no substance abuse issues, are over 50. Men diagnosed with a mental health disorder were more likely to abuse drugs than females. Approximately 67% of dual diagnosis patients were employed. Approximately 62% of patients with only a mental health disorder were employed. Employment obstacles that face adults with psychiatric disabilities, gaps in work history, limited employment experience, lack of confidence, fear and anxiety, workplace discrimination, inflexibility, social stigma, rigid income support, benefit programs. Unemployment rates of persons with serious mental illness reflects these obstacles, ranging from 70 to 90%, depending on the severity of the disability. Of all persons with disabilities, those with a serious mental illness have the highest degree of stigmatization in the workplace, face the greatest barriers to employment. These statistics are particularly disturbing in light of the fact productive work is identified as a leading component in promoting positive mental health. Legal Aid Ontario, LAO. As many as 1 in 3 legal aid certificates goes to a client with mental health or addiction needs. Clients with mental health and addictions account for approximately 25% of the LAO's annual budget. Legal Aid is developing a mental health strategy to strengthen the capacity of lawyers, frontline workers, management to better serve clients with mental illness. It is a multifaceted, multi-year strategy that will improve access to services, increase capacity, and build on the LOA's current client services. Missed work. 500,000 Canadians missed work today due to mental health issues.